The most important weapon you have as an entrepreneur, a lot of times, is that you're solving a problem.
Happy New Year. And if you're listening to this later in the year, happy belated New Year to you. I hope it's been a fantastic year. Welcome back to the Wild Business Growth Podcast, presented by Hippo Direct. This is your place to hear from a new entrepreneur or innovator every single Wednesday morning who's turning wild ideas into wild growth. I'm your host, Max Branstetter, digital marketing dude at Hippo Direct, and you can reach me at max@hippodirect.com for help using your podcast as a marketing tool. This is episode number 75, and of course we have a wild story for you today. Today's guest is Justin Delaney. He's the CEO of Buff City Soap, which is doing a whole lot of shaking going on in the soap world, and he is the founder of Menguin. Menguin is a wedding attire rental company that he and team sold to Generation Tux, owned by Men's Warehouse, for $25 million after just 3 years in business. He's worked with Mark Cuban, George Zimmer, and Scott Dorsey, and he has some incredible stories to share. Justin is just in. Enjoy the show. Alrighty, we are here with Justin Delaney, the man behind Menguin himself and the CEO of Buff City Soap, and my fellow Hoosier. How you doing today, Justin?
I'm doing great, Max. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic as well. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know you have a pretty hectic schedule, so this is really, really cool connecting. We're going to get into a lot about how you've had so much success with Menguin and eventually sold that for $25 million and how you also, your vision and what you want to achieve with Buff City Soap. But before we get into that, I want to take it way back. Did you always know that you were going to be an entrepreneur or a business leader?
You know, in a way, yes. I've always been drawn to trying to make money on the edges of society, one could say, and not a conventional type of role. And, for me, a lot of this started probably in middle school. I'd buy candy in bulk and I would sell it at school. So I'd buy, say, 5 pounds of sour gumballs. I think they were called tear jerkers or something. And I'd bring them to school and sell them for $0.25 each, great fat 80% margin.
You mean like warheads, like those things?
Yeah, they weren't warheads. So warheads came out a little bit after this. So I would literally go to a store where you would buy the stuff and by the pound. And so I'd have this,
God.
I'd show up to school, it's 7th grade, like a sort of, kind of a drug dealer, but, obviously I was selling gumballs as opposed to something illicit. So that was kind of one of my first experiences as an entrepreneur. And then through life and just through like sort of getting dealt somewhat aberrant hands in the game of life, I've been forced a lot of times to go back and come up with my own plan for things as opposed to getting hired in a great job. Like it wasn't until actually I left Kelly that I even got hired by a great company. Delta Airlines hired me for their executive leadership rotation program. But until that point, like no one would ever hire me to do anything. And so again and again, I had to sort of rely on my own, ideas to generate cash, to be able to do what I wanted. And so that's kind of been a theme of my life since, I was probably 10. And, my father is an entrepreneur. My grandfather is an entrepreneur. So it's definitely in the family to some extent.
What shifted? How did you go from this kid who nobody saw getting hired by companies to working for such a major company and then starting such major companies?
Sure. So it's kind of an interesting story that I'll try to keep from being too personal about. But, I went to college like most people do, when I was 18. And about a year or two into it, I just kind of had decided that it wasn't for me. And a few things sort of drove that. One being that I had an excellent job as, a bartender. And that paid better than most people make when they graduate from college. And it's also very fun to do that kind of work, obviously. As a young single male, it was just sort of fantastic to be able to go out and get paid for it and to, be one of the guys in the bar that everyone has to talk to. So you don't have to worry about, awkwardly approaching anybody, like say a girl you like or something like that. So anyway, I
Of
ended up
course.
kind of falling out of sort of the traditional path. And it actually, from when I started college to when I finished college was about 10 years, as a result of sort of leaving. And I think what happened was, I bartended for a few years. I moved around the US, and at some point in my mid 20s, I sort of looked at myself and I thought, my life isn't heading in the direction that I wish it to head. And all the things I want to accomplish, I'm worried that I will not be able to accomplish because of some of the choices I've made. And I've always been very unconventional. I thought school was a waste of time. And I have a lot of opinions that people don't necessarily agree with, but this was one place where I decided to go back on the well-worn path because I felt like I had wandered a little too far, afield, so to speak. And basically, I went back to college in my late 20s and finished up school and graduated when I was 30. But really, what happened was I spent literally 5 to 7 years just investing in myself. I went to school. I took it very seriously. Outside of school, I read a few books a week. I was obsessed with bettering my station in life. I quit going out. I was just focused on being as good as possible at my craft for many, many years. And this sort of experience led me to, IU, and it led me to start Menguin, and it led me to work at Delta. And it's, continues to drive me today. I sort of have this discipline in trying to get better at what I am as an entrepreneur every single day. But really, this started in my mid 20s, sort of like, hungover one day after a particularly wild night out tending the bar, and I kind of sat back and I looked at people who were a little older than me that were bartenders and kind of was thinking to myself, I don't necessarily want to be that when I grow up.
Well, you see that, you can feel that discomfort there. And I think that self-drive and self-discipline you talked about is something that is so commonly shared with the best of the best entrepreneurs out there. So it's really fascinating that you recognize that. And it really clicked once you were hungover, I think.
Totally.
And so you made an emphasis to get more towards what you wanted to do in life. And I know before you started Menguin and before you got to Buff City Soap, I remember from when you came and spoke at my entrepreneurship class in Kelly, you were starting Menguin at the time, but you were also had tons of fresh experience from Delta, where in Delta, you were really more of an entrepreneur. So can you talk about Delta for a little bit? So what did you take away from that experience, and what was your main goal when you were at Delta as far as creating something within that massive organization? I mean, literally global organization.
Absolutely. So Delta is just a fabulous company, and certainly in the U.S., the best airline, and probably the best run airline globally. Like it's a fantastic organization. I was sad to leave, and one of the things that drew me to Delta initially was that I'm obsessed with travel. When I did finally graduate from college, no one would hire me because I spent 10 years in undergrad probably, and it was the height of the Great Recession, and so I started traveling and day trading, and actually my wife's family was really nervous about where we were physically in the world, whether we'd be in Borneo or Egypt, and she was just my girlfriend at the time, but she, they thought it was unusual, so I started a travel blog that actually became pretty popular. And I ended up getting hired by AOL to be a features writer for their travel blog. And that brought me all over the world. But sort of that experience led me to Delta because I knew that I wanted to do something in travel. And I was trying to hack like the best way to travel for free. Because writing about it was great, but I didn't always have control over where I wanted to go. And I knew that if I worked for an airline, I could do non-revenue travel, as it's called. And so when I was at IU, I kind of set my sights on Delta, and that's sort of how I ended up there. It was my number one choice, and thankfully they hired me as an intern, and I ended up taking a full-time job with them as well post graduation. But yeah, as an entrepreneur, it really comes down to a few things, and part of it's luck, and then part of it's the opportunity set you have in front of you and your talents. And so on the luck side, first and foremost, you have to be placed in an organization where you're going to have a boss or a boss's boss that is going to allow you to draw outside the lines, because that's number one. Like in my experiences at Delta, I had a number of bosses, several were great, some were okay, but the ones that I could thrive under were the ones that would allow me to draw outside the lines. And so when I was initially an intern at Delta, I mean, this is, I'm coming in as a kid basically, and they gave me
As a
control.
4-year-old.
Yeah, totally. Like this actually happened in the mid '80s when I was still a child. No, but I came in the organization as a nobody and an outsider, and I had a really great manager, this guy named John Morris, who still is one of the most fantastic managers I've ever met in my life. And we talked about, okay, this is what you have to do, to do a good job here, and then provided you do that, like we can talk about other interesting things that you can do. And I was so obsessed with getting to the exciting stuff that, my 12-week internship was, I pretty much produced the document I needed to produce for the whole summer internship within the first, 3 or 4 weeks. And I told John,
Wow.
I'm ready to get to the exciting stuff now. And I worked my ass off to get that done. But that's sort of the thing. And in these big environments, you really need to, work like an entrepreneur and find those exciting opportunities. And so what was great there is at that point, John trusted me enough to allow me to sort of go off reservation and find my own things. And that's sort of how that worked. And then, when I was a full-time employee at Delta, I worked in revenue management, which is effectively pricing, not the most exciting part of a company typically, but in airlines, revenue management is awesome because there are so many flights, and it's pretty much the backbone of, actually the operation's the backbone of the industry, but at a corporate level, revenue management is one of the most important organizations. And so, it was kind of similar. I managed LAX inventory management for Delta, which was a huge focus as a hub. And I think the first year I was doing that, we'd got revenues up 85% year over year. So super great growth. And I, can't take credit for that. A lot of that was network planning, just planning a ton of new routes. But in the end, that was going so fabulously that my manager in revenue management said, if you want to work on other stuff, you can. And so I worked with a lot of the operations PhDs that Delta has on sort of intraday pricing and ways to better price the front cabin, and sort of more like, say, holistic strategies that weren't just pigeonholed into my LAX, sort of revenue management scope of work. And so, I mean, that's kind of the thing. I think to be able to be an entrepreneur, you have to do your job really well enough that someone's going to trust you to go out and touch other parts of the organization as sort of an ambassador from whatever organization you're coming from. And that's where the most innovation can happen in big companies, because the people at the top, sometimes they don't see all the connections that can be made on sort of the front lines.
And I think what you said about your manager was so crucial, because we see a lot of times that just if somebody becomes too much of a micromanager, it can just suck the life out of somebody. Whereas when you instill the confidence and the freedom in your team to go out and explore and make connections, as you said, then that's really where the magic happens. So you're like a living, breathing example of that. So let's get to Menguin and Buff City Soap. So we'll start with Menguin. And Menguin, for anybody listening, is just like penguin, but with an M instead of a P. And the super quick summary is a tuxedo and suit and other wedding attire rental company. Is that right? I think that's your official description, right?
Absolutely. That works.
Perfect. Cool. I'll collect the check later. Anyway, Menguin is something that you started. And as I mentioned, when you came in, I met you and you spoke at my class in Kelly. I think it was spring of 2014. And at the time, it was around the time you were just starting Menguin. And I remember after that class, I was so inspired by what you had to say. And a lot of what you spoke about was entrepreneurship at Delta, that I reached out on LinkedIn. And I think I honestly at the time just thought that you were you were a cool person and would be an interesting connection to have and stay in touch with. And so we've been connected on LinkedIn for quite some time. And not too long ago, I saw your connection, Justin Delaney, has been mentioned in the news. And this is when you were signed on to Buff City Soap as the CEO. And I went and I dug more into your background and saw that this little idea you had of Menguin at the time is something that you blossom into an extreme growth business. You got partnerships with some of the biggest names out there from the funding standpoint, and you ultimately sold it for $25 million to Generation Tux, who is owned by Men's Warehouse and the famous George Zimmer. So I think my jaw dropped to the floor when I saw how much you had taken that little idea you spoke about in class and what it was up to now. Let's get to the origin of that. Where did this idea for Menguin come from in the first place?
Sure. So most of what I do always starts somewhere else in the world. It's one of those things where the universe sort of rewards you for going out, being as curious as possible, meeting as many people as possible, going to as many places as possible. And so this kind of all started in Southeast Asia. I was, being hustled at some apparel shop in Thailand, and they're trying to sell me a custom suit. And I was just kind of going through the motions because I always had been a fan of suiting and clothing in general. And I couldn't believe how cheaply I could get a custom suit made for in Bangkok. And I knew that I was getting ripped off as well. It's one of those things where anytime you're being spoken to in a foreign country, you're probably being ripped off to some extent. Anyway, I was just blown away by how cheaply I could get a custom suit for. And I actually didn't even buy one, but I kind of took that thought with me, and I spent some time trying to sort of build a mental supply chain on how it could work to actually do custom suits in the US that were manufactured in Asia and with fabric from Italy. Basically the model Indochino ended up doing, though this was before they existed. So I spent some time thinking on that, but at the time I was a travel writer, and I'd get a call from the government in Dubai saying, hey, you need to cover this new restaurant that's opening at the tallest building in the world. Or I'd get a call from Virgin Galactic and they'd say, hey, we're launching a space shuttle out of SFO in a few weeks. Can you be in San Francisco? Richard Branson and Buzz Aldrin will be there. So I'm getting all these awesome assignments, and there's just no time to be an apparel entrepreneur. But I really thought there was something there, and but I knew I needed the discipline and the backdrop in my life to make that happen. And so this is actually what led me to IU. I sort of took the GMAT on a lark, got a high enough score to get a scholarship to a good school, and ended up going to IU under sort of the initiative that while I was there for those 2 years, I would start a company and create my own job. And that company was initially going to be a custom suit company. And so I get to IU and I meet this great guy named Kurt Sutton. We became friends, and he actually had worked on Wall Street covering retail stocks. And anyway, he kind of had a bit of a background in this sort of stuff as well. And we were both in a lot of these sort of entrepreneurial groups together. And him, myself, and another guy named Mike Gassman just started meeting about suiting and this sort of thing. And Kurt one weekend went to a wedding in Ohio, I believe. And he basically had the worst experience renting a tux possible. It took him 12 hours total of just sort of administrative tasks just to rent this tux. He had to drive from Bloomington to Indianapolis to get fitted and then back. And then he had to drive to Indianapolis again to pick it up and then go to Ohio. And then he went back to Indianapolis to drop it off, and they were closed. And so he had to end up doing another trip later from Bloomington to Indianapolis. And we were just sort of in the madness of this terrible customer experience, saw just immense opportunity. And since we were all in business school, we sort of sat back and said, okay, well, let's just pragmatically dissect this industry. And so we did some primary research. We basically asked a bunch of people who had rented suits or tuxedos what they thought of the industry. We found out the negative sentiment was very high. I think it was 84%, and the neutral was 9%. So this is an industry that just empirically sucks. And so that was exciting. And then we started digging into the 10Ks of companies like Men's Warehouse who report their tux rental income. And, this is public information. We saw that they had, I think it was 80 or 85% gross margins. And we were just holy shit. So exactly. These guys are making a ton of money off of an experience the customer hates. That's our next business. And so that day, Menguin was born. And honestly, we really didn't look back. We gathered more data. We figured out sort of our place and how to build the model. And then, we ended up raising money from some great IU alums like Mark Cuban and Scott Dorsey. And Scott's been just such a fantastic mentor to me. We still talk pretty frequently. I'm talking to him next week to just get caught up.
Tell him I say hi, please.
I will. I'll tell
he doesn't know who I am, but I'm sure we're best buds.
Yeah, he's like this sort of very accessible guy, very successful and accessible. And that's not always
Yeah.
the case with these types of individuals. But, Mark was great too. Just having Mark on the cap table opened a ton of doors, both with
Oh,
in
yeah.
customers. And so that was kind of the story. And, we all left Kelly with sort of this company Menguin, and a couple of us had actually taken full-time jobs. I went to Delta, and Kurt had gone to Target, and so we sort of worked on it in the evenings. That's kind of how everything got started. But that's the origin story, man.
Appreciate it. That's pretty wild. I mean, so you had the idea that you were going to do something in this space beforehand, and then you literally have examples while you're at school of holy shit, we need to do that. Like this is like our friends are struggling from this right now. I of course have to dive into your connections with Mark Cuban and Scott Dorsey, and obviously these are well-known names. I mean, in IU lore as well as just globally recognized. Mark Cuban, I mean, his reputation precedes him. Scott Dorsey, for anybody who's not familiar with, started Exact Target, which is this massive agency out of Indy who he sold to Salesforce. So these are just two of the most inspiring and impressive business people out there. How did you get connected with them in the first place?
At the time at IU, every year there was a business plan competition, and I don't believe it exists anymore. And sort of the business plan competition it was hosted by the School of Informatics, but it was open to all IU students. And sort of the idea there was they got a bunch of very successful IU alumni together to more or less seed fund a bunch of really small companies, like typically pre-revenue. They're investing in a PowerPoint deck type companies. And so that the year that we pitched, Mark Cuban was one of those individuals. Scott Dorsey was one of those individuals. Matt Ferguson, who runs Career Builder, was one of those individuals. There's a bunch of other great ones. Like there's a guy named Ching Chang Wu who's managed a bunch of 9-figure tech exits. Just a really
Wow.
fantastic guy. That's also that not many people have heard of, but he's just insanely successful. And so it was kind of funny because these individuals, invested in Menguin, and as I, from this period, they did this every year for maybe 4 years or something like that. And we were the only company that so far has exited from that experience. Hopefully there'll be a few more, but
Wow.
we got from start to finish in about 3 years, so it's pretty fast. But yeah, so that was how we got connected with them. And what's interesting about it is, Scott at the time was selling Exact Target to Salesforce, which honestly, fantastic deal for both Scott and the community of Indianapolis. I mean, that's
Yeah.
sort of what you worry about with a big transaction like that is, when you're such a big presence in a city like Indy, like you end up maybe losing focus as an ecosystem. And Scott just, I mean, what a great asset for the state of Indiana and Indianapolis, because he basically, Salesforce built a massive office there. And I mean, Indy is sort of a regional hub for definitely B2B cloud-based SaaS, but a lot of sort
Yeah.
of tech stuff. And, a lot of that is basically Scott's fault because he's such a great guy, and he really does believe in the community there. And he's just such a great steward of that community.
And so you have these amazing connections. And as you alluded to, you had a super quick exit. I mean, 3 years, like, and anybody who's in the business world and starting out their career knows how quick 3 years goes often when it's your first job or early in your career. 3 years, you had an exit, an amazing exit, and became part of Generation Talks Men's Warehouse, which everybody knows George Zimmer, the founder and guy on TV, that you're going to like the way you look. I guarantee it, which that we'll sample in his actual voice, I'm sure. But what would you say is the biggest factor, the biggest thing that allowed you to grow so much and exit and sell your company within such a short time frame?
The most important thing, the most important weapon you have as an entrepreneur, a lot of times, is that you're solving a problem. This is why, a lot of SaaS companies do well just by nature. They're trying to solve a problem with software. And so for us, we knew we were solving a problem because we knew how bad the customer sentiment was in this industry. And so you have to go back to 2013 to think about this correctly. There was no online solution to renting a suit or tuxedo. and Rent the Runway had just launched. And so what we were sitting around, pontificating on was, okay, well, let's be the men's version of Rent the Runway, because there's clearly a bad experience here. And so that's kind of the kernel of why it was successful, is we were solving this problem for men that didn't want to go into the store at the time of a greater, direct to consumer wave. This is, Warby Parker and Dollar Shave Club and all these companies are coming out around this time. And so we were just doing it in this sort of obscure niche. And so that really helped a ton. And we were just fantastic marketers on, social and on Google, and that helped a ton too. But I think one of the most critical things we did, and this we did out of necessity, which is funny. You always see these sort of entrepreneurs who create an innovation that is out of necessity. And what we did is we realized very early on with this company that it is basically brides and grooms who are renting from us. 90% of our business is weddings. And these people don't just want to click a button online and wait until 2 weeks before their wedding, receive a suit in the mail and be like, okay, I hope it's okay. Like these are people who are planning this day like it's a military operation. Like it is the most important thing. Because for a lot of women, it's literally the most important day of their life up to that point.
Right.
And so we realized that, okay, these people are going to be calling us a shitload. And so early on, and this is one of the first months we were in operation, we set up a phone line that basically if a customer called Menguin, it rang on all the founders' phones. And so we'd get a call.
God.
Yeah, and we'd fight for those calls, but really what that created is just an insane level of customer empathy. Like we knew when something was broken on the website, and we'd have, something in production within a few minutes because we're the ones that are hearing it and we're the ones that can execute it. And so we actually did this for 2 years. I mean, I was still taking phone calls on Saturday nights, at 3 a.m. when we were doing, say $2-3 million run rate. And so it's sort of this just fantastic necessity that created just really high customer IQ. And I forgot to mention, we had 24/7 customer service. So this wasn't like, a 9-to-5 thing. This was I'm going to leave dinner and talk to this customer about his inseam length. And it was just one of those things that the team made such sacrifices to get that to work. And then, eventually we had, a call center with 30 people in it and all that. And we were too busy to spend time with customers on the phone all the time, and we had the resources to fix that, necessity problem. But that really, that drove a ton because, we were competing against 3 companies who raised over 40 or $50 million. Those founders weren't on the phone with their customers. They didn't know what their customers wanted. That was our competitive advantage. And it's not necessarily a sustainable competitive advantage, but it was, you don't need a sustainable competitive advantage if you're selling your company in 2 or 3 years.
So are you saying that you literally would get phone calls like all through the night and it's your whole team's getting them?
Yeah, but we did set up, we'd set up who was on the overnight shift. So there'd be one person on the overnight shift typically. And this wasn't set up early on, but it ended up being something we set up at one point just because a few of us were taking the bulk of the calls, especially in the middle of the night. And we were all getting woken up, which obviously is terrible for performance probably. And so, but yeah, it would be like, I'd usually take Saturday nights and, someone would call at 3 a.m. Sometimes a drunk person would call at 3 a.m. complaining about their pants being too long. And you'd sort of
hate when that happens.
Yep. And it's just such an unusual experience, but it really armed us to make the right decisions on behalf of our customers.
Yeah. And I think so as you were saying that, I'm thinking a parallel to another group of co-founders that we had on the podcast previously, the guys from Empathy Wines, Gary V's wine company, John Troutman and Nate Schroeder, because they're trying to disrupt the wine industry by having a direct-to-consumer winery. And so they have the same mindset that you had at the start there is, hey, there's nobody doing this. We really need to disrupt this way. And we want to have as much empathy for the consumer as possible. Of course, they have empathy for their farmers as well. And you use the term empathy, so I had to bring them up. But
yeah, totally.
I think this trend of direct to consumer is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so you found your niche there from the rental side of things, the suit rental and attire wedding attire rental side of things really, really early on, but you were just relentless with the customer service. So again, that's where the magic happens.
Yep. There's only one. The customers are all that really matters, honestly.
Yeah. So let's get to the next part of your career. So after that, and when you sold it, I know you served as president of Generation Tux for a little while, but then after that, you made a big change, and now you're the CEO of Buff City Soap. So why the change? How did this come about?
Selling Menguin was a difficult decision. We were basically sitting there with two options. One was we could raise a big Series A, and one was we could sell the company. And so we obviously chose to sell the company, which in and of itself is a great story. George is a fabulous guy, and we had so many great experiences sort of just trying to figure out how to get this to work. And I can't say enough nice things about him. But so he sort of, acquired our company, and then he was based in California and I was the president in Louisville. So his company was based in Louisville, Kentucky. And so I moved to Louisville to sort of run this operation, and it went great. It was fun, but about a year in, George and I were kind of, there's something that happens when you sell your company, like it just isn't the same afterwards. And I was very naive about that, and I thought, that rule won't apply to me. And a lot of founders have told me, like, yeah, you're not going to like it as much, and I didn't like it as much. And so George and I, had a conversation about it, and he was like, you know what, just take the next year to travel, spend time with your family. I have three kids. At this time I had three kids under 5. And, I'd been working nonstop for years. Like, even when I was at Delta, it was, I'd work 9 to 5 and then 5 to 3 in the morning and then get up and do it again. And so I took the year to travel as much as possible and spend time with my family. So I went and, I walked the Silk Road and did all these weird things. And I was just kind of hanging out, hearing offers from venture capital and from private equity primarily. Like, either there's a company that's high growth, would you be interested in being the CEO? Or there's this company that fell apart, would you be a refounder? Like, all these things that I'd never heard of before, and all these worlds I didn't know exist were suddenly, hitting me up left and right. And I have this one friend of mine named Mike Sutton, who's a private equity guy in Dallas. And him and I are just like kindred spirits. He's probably my favorite investor I've ever met in my life. And he never invested in Menguin or anything, but we met through that process, and we kept in touch. And, around probably April or March of this year, he reached out to me and said, "Hey man, I think I found your next job." And that was Buff City Soap.
So you're in the soap world now. You've probably never been more clean. So congrats on that. Buff City Soap, what are you trying to achieve as CEO? And as a second part of that, what makes Buff City Soap different from any other soap out there?
What we're trying to achieve is we want to be a global brand. We want to be as ubiquitous as Starbucks. And the interesting thing about soap is it's a very high total addressable market. The main lesson I learned from Menguin and Gen Tux, yes, the margins were great. Yes, we were right to chase down that opportunity. But in the end, it was a really small market that a bunch of people were competing for. You had us, you had Black Tux, you had Generation Tux, a company called Zito, Men's Warehouse. Like, all of these people are chasing a market that's really just $1 billion to $1.5 billion. It's tiny. And that created so much headwind on the customer acquisition front that it was an exhausting model to scale. And so for my next exercise that I was sort of, going to pragmatically do to choose my next job, it was like I wanted something that had, pretty high margins and that also had a high total addressable market, or TAM. And what we found was that soap, it's a massive market. I mean, you're not talking about just bars of soap, but you're talking about laundry. We sell laundry soap, we sell skincare. I mean, if you add up all the categories we sell and you project it out globally, it's a $1.5 trillion market.
Holy
cow. So that's interesting to me, because I can do that math and know that, okay, there's a room for a lot of people in that mix. And so that's sort of the plan, is to, capture as much of that $1.5 trillion industry as possible.
Oh, you got all of it right off the bat, I'm sure. 1.5 trillion. Yeah. Nothing to sneeze
at. That would be impossible to just manage, I imagine. I got really scared when you said that. But,
Well, you're realistic, so that's good.
even grabbing, a small percentage of that would be fantastic. And so anyway, so that's sort of what we're going for. We're opening stores. We opened a store in Arizona this weekend. We have stores all over the US. We're opening our 31st store this weekend. And that's the other thing about this that I love is, after playing in Menguin and Gen Talks, direct to consumer is fantastic. It's great. It does a lot of things. But the thing no one ever tells you, actually, now it's sort of spoken about, but at the time when we first started doing it, we didn't know this going into it, is just how expensive customer acquisition is. Mm-hmm. And basically, not only are you competing against other companies for customer acquisition, but you're having to pay, two of the biggest companies in the world, primarily Facebook and Google, and to some extent now Amazon, if you're selling on Amazon. And it's a terrible, terrible table to be at playing poker. Like, you're sitting at playing poker with Facebook, Google, and Amazon. Like, you're not going to win that many hands. And so one of the things that really intrigued me about Buff City Soap is it's direct to consumer, but we have our own retail stores, which totally it's actually a proprietary distribution channel. We don't have to rely on Walmart or Target or Amazon, or we don't have to pay customers through Google or Facebook. I mean, we'll do that anyway, but it's not so central to our business that if they change the algorithm, it changes our profitability, which happens to everyone in direct to consumer. So none of these companies are really that profitable. I mean, Dollar Shave Club, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago about how a lot of direct to consumer brands are having to get on retail shelves now, which is a much lower margin environment than selling direct to consumer. But they're doing that because it's just so expensive to acquire people online, and it's so competitive. Anyone can stand up a direct to consumer company in 10 minutes. And so companies like Dollar Shave Club still aren't profitable. That's wild, but it speaks volumes for how much of a red herring direct to consumer can be from a profitability standpoint. Sure, it's exciting from a revenue standpoint, and millennials love a lot of these companies, but at the end of the day, the EBITDA profile of a lot of direct to consumer companies is just comedic.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys have had a ton of success with funding early on. If you had to narrow it down to one thing, what would you say is the one most attractive thing about Buff City Soap that has allowed you to have so much success with investors?
It comes down to the experience. Go to a store. It's a fantastic experience. The product is absolutely unbelievable, which is kind of wrapped up into the experience. But it's like a bakery for soap. Basically, everything we sell in a store, we physically make in that store. So, you'll be talking to your salesperson, and that might be the same person that made that bar of soap, last week or whatever. And so you can ask them about it. And it's just, in today's environment, especially in skincare, there's just such a disgusting, dirty supply chain that reaches all over the world and just funnels products into the US. And you don't really know where stuff's coming from. And you don't even know if these companies are actually living up to the values they profess. And so what's great about Buff is you go in there and you literally, we make everything in the store. So if you buy a bar of soap in Dyersburg, Tennessee, that bar of soap was made in Dyersburg, Tennessee. You can literally watch people
That's awesome.
It. And so that sort of transparency really creates a great customer environment.
It does. Oh, I'm excited to check it out. So I'll get on the next flight to Dyersburg there.
Might have to fly private for that one, Max.
Yeah. Oh, no problem. I'll just call up one of my private jets.
So you finally decide to start a podcast. Congrats. You've never been more excited. But wait a sec. You quickly find out this is way more of a time commitment than you initially thought. You're going to need someone that has you covered behind the scenes. That's where I come in. Email me at max@hippodirect.com and let's get wild.
So let's get to a fan favorite segment called the Wild Business Shoutout of the Week.
The Wild Business Shoutout of the Week!
Wild Business Shoutout of the Week. So this is where we talk about a recent product or campaign or trend that caught our attention. And Tesla Cybertruck, a lot going on there, but we'll need to keep it brief here. But what is it about the Cybertruck and this polygonal, I don't know how to say that word, but interesting looking truck that caught your attention?
Sure. So I'm obsessed with cars and automotive in general. I just absolutely love cars. And What's interesting about this car is that it's obviously very aberrant looking, and its design is more cyberpunk than Pininfarina or any sort of traditional design that you see in automobiles. And without commenting on the design, I want to comment on how it came out of the company, because I think that's the most interesting thing here. Is literally you have this business that's a big public company, and they were able to sort of produce this car or this truck that is just so different than anything else on the road. And what's interesting about big companies is pretty much everything's done sort of by committee, and everyone lobs off a corner, whether it be finance or accounting or marketing or sales or operations. There's always a reason to compromise and dumb it down. And so what always fascinates me is when you see these products that make it into the wild that clearly haven't been very compromised. And the Cybertruck is one of those. It's, in a way, the design is totally different, but the language of innovation is similar to the iPhone coming out of Apple with Steve Jobs refusing to put a stylus in it and really being focused on delivering a specific product. And that's I think the most beautiful thing about this is it shows that centrally at Tesla they have an environment where they can still take risks. And it really reminds me of an old story from the 60s, and that's Lee Iacocca was basically trying to come up with a hip new car for baby boomers, effectively. I don't even know if they were called that yet. This was probably like 63, 64. And, it was the Mustang. Like him and his team, the Fairlane group, like they even had to leave Ford to design this car because they didn't want to be inundated with the bureaucracy of that big company. And they designed the Mustang, which obviously still exists today. So who knows? Maybe the Cybertruck is the next Mustang. I don't know. But certainly it is a different product that came out of a big company, and that's always just so exciting, especially when all the other Teslas are so damn boring looking, I have one. It's like, it looks like a, kind of a fancy Buick or something like that.
I like that name. The fancy Buick of the car world.
They just have really boring design language. And the Model S has basically been around for 7 years now. So I just love that they took such a big risk and that risk was able to shine, because in most companies, by the time it hits the stage, it's been so compromised it's boring.
Yeah, and so they, that's Elon or Lee Iacocca. They clearly were passionate about these ideas and stuck to it, no matter what anybody said. So that's it's really neat to see.
Exactly, that's important.
Definitely is. So only a tidbit of time left here. Would love to wrap up with some quick rapid fire Q&A. You ready for it?
Yep.
All right, let's get wild. Who is your favorite rapper of all time?
Ooh, my favorite rap group of all time is A Tribe Called Quest.
Yeah, Tribe, love them. All right, what's your favorite place you've ever traveled?
I love Tokyo. I go 2 or 3 times a year. I'm obsessed.
Definitely on the bucket list. What is your favorite book of all time?
It's probably The Great Gatsby. I read it when I was 15, and it was sort of it served as a impetus for a lot of ambition early in my life.
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear where that creativity inspiration comes from, because it's not always business books. And then quirks. What would you say is a quirk you have that maybe your kids or family or friends, somebody calls you out for, that's just something about your personality?
Sure. So I have a ton. And one of my favorite interview questions I always ask people is, tell me something about yourself that you believe in that no one agrees with you about. And I have a long list of those. I think jeans are stupid. They're basically pants. They're miner pants that everyone wear. Literally they're pants designed for people that were mining gold, and everyone walks around wearing these, miner pants. I think that's strange. I eat my cereal without milk. So that's kind of unusual. I could keep going on too, but
we'll need to do
I'll leave it at those two.
We'll need to do a follow-up on that. Well, I hope you enjoy your cereal and do not have milk with it. Thanks so much, Justin, for coming on and sharing your story.
Yeah, thanks, Max.
Of course. Where's the best place for people to connect with you?
So connect with me, on Instagram. It's just Dela, JUSTDELA. Also, I'm on LinkedIn. You can hit me up there, unless you're, selling a SaaS product, because I already get about 20 of those messages a day.
There goes my idea. Damn. All right. Perfect. Well, thanks so much. Last thing here, it could be a line, a quote, whatever you want. Final thoughts. Send us off here.
if you want to do something in life, as an entrepreneur, the most important thing to do is do it. And what I mean by do it is do it with a customer. You can sit around and think about your idea and your product and brainstorm and talk with your friends and do all this bullshit that everyone does when they try to start a company that is so meaningless and such a waste of time. And I'm guilty of this as well. I've done it. But truly, you have no information until you start to interact with customers and understand what they think about your product, what they want your product to be. So for anyone out there, wanting to be an entrepreneur, you don't actually become one until, you create something for someone else and you get their feedback about it. And then you make it a little better, and then you make it a little better. And it's just this constant feedback loop.
And it keeps going and going and going and going. Repeat, etc. Continued. Thank you so much, Justin, for coming on the podcast. And thank you, Wild listeners, for tuning in to another episode. If you want to hear more wild stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite app and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. You can also soak up our show notes, bonus content, and marketing and business growth resources at hippodirect.com/blog and hippodirect.com/newsletter. That newsletter is the Hippo Digest, and it's your place for wild marketing ideas every single week. And of course, come say hey or your greeting of choice on your favorite social media channels at the handles Hippo Direct and Max Branstetter. Until next time, let your business run wild.
Bring on the bongos!